Newsfirst, NEWSLINE.
Hello there, very good evening. Welcome to another edition of NEWSLINE Live. Sri Lanka is currently in an economic crisis. It's the understatement of the century, of course. Everybody knows that. But what are we really doing to get out of this? We can't get out of this rut alone. And that is the reason why we have gone to the international community and opened up our books. We are now transparent to a certain degree. We've asked IMF. We've asked the help of other international partners here in the global West, the East and the South, and they have really come to help us. But Sri Lanka's foreign policy in all of this still has a big question. What is the foreign policy of Sri Lanka? Do we really have a foreign policy here in Sri Lanka? What can be done to better the foreign policy of Sri Lanka? To discuss these matters and more, we've got foreign policy analyst Kusum Vijaythilaka, also a working committee member of the Samagi Janabalavegia. A very good evening, Kusum, and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thanks for inviting me on your show.
Kusum, to start off first, now the most recent massive interaction that Sri Lanka had with the global community was the United Nations General Assembly. A delegation left from Sri Lanka. The president made a speech there. He laid out the position of Sri Lanka, made certain requests from the international community. Your thoughts on everything that unfolded, starting from, of course, the address the president gave at the United Nations General Assembly.
So, Sharon, at the start you mentioned I'm a member of the SJB Working Committee, so I don't think I can say I'm completely unbiased in this situation. The president's speech, I think any Sri Lankan has the right to do that. When you consider his speech to the General Assembly of the United Nations, it's interesting that he first started out by obviously mentioning that there's been global crises throughout the world. Of course, he personalized that to Sri Lanka, and I think at this time he specifically mentioned, at this time last year, I'm quoting Mr. Wickremesinghe, President Wickremesinghe, at this time last year, amidst multiple global crises, Sri Lanka was experiencing its most challenging period in recent times, socially, economically and politically, which had a devastating impact on people's lives. So that's completely understood. But the very next line he says is that even our democratic traditions were threatened by attempts to occupy our parliament and bring it to a halt. So at the very outset, and this is the United Nations General Assembly, right? So and the entire world has already seen the news reports over the last year, the last 1.5 years, okay? But at the outset, he's making the claim that the democratic traditions being threatened, it almost seems like he's saying that's where things started, right? There was very little conversation about how Sri Lanka got to that position. He seemed to, in the same paragraph, since he talked about global crises, the pandemic, and he's done this before in several media spots locally as well, where he talks about the pandemic as being a key driver of Sri Lanka's economic collapse. Now, you and I know that the pandemic was, was a contributor, but hardly the main factor in our political and social collapse and economic collapse. He then goes on to talk about, even in his speech, I have to say, and the audience is well advised to take this as critique. He says, the reforms, I quote, the reforms I have since initiated in the economic, financial institution and reconciliation fronts have been directed on the one hand towards rebuilding trust and confidence between the people and the government. Now, if you take that statement that I've just read by President Wickremesinghe and the previous statement that I met regarding the threats to democratic traditions, I think you have to understand the picture he's trying to paint. Now, for example, the democratic traditions have also been threatened by this president because he has prevented us from having one election. He's not funded the election commission. On the other hand, he talks about, rebuilding trust and confidence between the people and the government without really having any people's mandate and without giving the Sri Lankan people some idea of when we can go for a people's mandate. So immediately you can see that his comments are skewed towards a certain narrative, a narrative that encompasses himself, his party and the ruling SLPP majority in parliament. So he's sort of giving the international community a narrative that I think it's quite easy for anyone to discern and say, is that completely accurate? Okay, so from there he goes on to talk about, and I want to come to an interview he gave later on, or maybe even before he gave the speech, where he talks to an audience about the Indian Ocean area and the Indian Ocean Rim Organization and how this geopolitical issues that are playing out between China and the United
India.
States is affecting Sri Lanka. And he keeps, I urge anyone to go, I think it's on YouTube, I urge anyone to go listen to it. He keeps telling the interviewer is obviously trying to ask him the question about, how does Sri Lanka fit into this situation of this global power game? And he keeps saying, well, there's a global rivalry, so why are you involving us? And that's not really an answer. The whole point of the question to Sri Lanka is because it's obvious that we have been on a tilt towards China, the growing Chinese footprint in Sri Lanka. Then given our proximity to India, our political history with India, all of this is why the question is being asked of him. So he simply says, well, why are you all involving us in it? We just want economic development. We just want to get along with everyone, et cetera, et cetera. It seemed a bit of a cop-out of an answer. I mean, there's an opportunity for him to reiterate several things. Sri Lanka's position on the, something your channel has talked about very regularly is the Sea of Sri Lanka. He could have talked about the Sea of Sri Lanka. He could have talked about Indian interference in Sri Lanka in a very diplomatic manner. He could have talked about Chinese footprint in Sri Lanka. He could have talked about our export markets. There were a lot of things he could have done. Having said that, I have to give him some credit. He did talk about some things which I'm sure we'll come to later. He was adamant of the Asia-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific region being a construct, which I think is, I agree with, but I think he sort of misses the point on why people are talking about the Asia-Pacific. So I think we can come to those things a little bit later.
So moving on also, the delegation that traveled to the United Nations in the United States, of course, was funded by the money of the taxpayers here in Sri Lanka. And for the longest time, I believe Sri Lankans really saw these things happening, massive delegations being taken out on various international tours. Those were just, well, to some, at least, they were just jolly excursions to go to a foreign country and have some fun on the taxpayers' dime. But however, with the economic crisis coming in, with taxes being increased, the people are closely watching every single rupee that the government is spending. Let's speak a bit about the delegation that traveled to the United Nations General Assembly. Now, the government has asked all Sri Lankans to tighten their belts. They've asked professionals to tighten their belts. They've said, look, we are in a crisis. We all need to unite to come out of this crisis, and together we need to suffer for the sins that have been committed in the past. The government, of course, needs to join in, as they call everybody to unite. They need to unite as well. So in this context, what do you really have to say about the delegation that traveled to the United Nations?
Well, there are some members of the delegation. I'll throw out a name, Member of Parliament Rohit Abegunaratne, for instance. I'm not entirely sure what input he brings to the delegation, but I think it's quite clear the President has to allay certain requests from the SLPP, from the Pohuttuva majority. You remember a few weeks ago there was a report that he had to visit Basil Rajapaksa to discuss the upcoming budget. And we've seen, pandering to the SLPP majority on several occasions by the President, and that's, I suppose, the position he's in, right? So he's not willing to call for general election, and he has a chance of, if he's really confident in himself and his party, he has a chance of gaining more seats than he has. I mean, currently the UNP has won. So there's only one way you can go, surely. So if he really wanted some more support in Parliament, if he really wanted to bridge the gap in trust, if he wanted to bridge the trust deficit with the Sri Lankan people, he has every opportunity to do so. But he hasn't done that. So these are the situations where you see, for example, Mr. Sabri's son, I think we talked off air, and I don't want to go too much into that. I think, he's a young man, and I'm sure he's a very capable young man. It's unfortunate that he's been pulled into this national spotlight in such an unfortunate way. But at the same time, Mr. Sabri has to understand the world's watching us, and the Sri Lankan people's watching the President and his delegation. So in that sense, you have to understand, even if you thought it was harmless to bring your child along, which I don't think it's harmless, having him in the pictures, I think, is really something. But I think, Charlene, if I may, not in defense of Mr. Sabri, but I think we all saw pictures of the Bangladeshi Prime Minister and her daughter with President Biden. I think she's also an official of the WHO. But, to take Western countries, we've seen in the recent past the Hunter Biden conversations in the United States. We know about Jared Kushner and his wife Ivanka Trump in the Trump White House, and we know all about Sri Lankan family involvements in politics. So I think in a way it speaks to sort of a depletion of norms right, around the world. And Sri Lanka has, I think, bookended it at both ends. We may have started this trend, or we have caught on to the trend, and then, we're kind of pushing it along as it were.
We were already a part of this trend for quite a long time, weren't we?
But what I think escapes the commentary somewhat is, when you see things like Mr. Sabri's son and you see Mr. Rohit Abhigunnar, it sparks a political conversation. But I want to go back to that the conversation, that the interview that President Vikram Singh gave. President Vikram Singh wasn't even asked the question, right? But he prompted the question to himself. He said, someone once asked me, are we pro-Indian or are we pro-Chinese? And he said, we are neither. Then he said, I was asked, am I neutral? And he said, no, I'm not neutral. I'm pro-Sri Lankan. So it's sort of, these are the kind of answers that we're getting from the president. They're not, I wouldn't say they're serious answers. But if you just, on one side, he asks, he says, he brings out the non-aligned mantra. So I see that he's trying to reinvigorate this non-aligned issue, but he doesn't touch on the problem, the point of why our non-alignment is in contention. The problem we have with saying we're non-aligned is because of the Chinese footprint, right? But he didn't want to bring that up in an international stage. But in that case, don't bring up the subject, because the interviewer was very nice to him. He didn't ask too many follow-ups. He sort of went away to a different question. But if he had asked, what about the growing Chinese footprint? I wonder what the president would have said at that point. So I think, it's important to understand that these are opportunities for Sri Lanka to go and represent ourselves abroad. And we've never needed solid representation abroad than now. This is the time when we need it the most. And I think, especially these one-on-one interviews with the journalist, you have a real opportunity to stake your country's foreign policy, your country's economic policy, and give people faith in the idea that Sri Lanka is part of the international order, if a part of the international community. Right now there's a lot of conversations about the rules-based international order, and Sri Lanka has to put our voice into that. There's also questions, especially with any international summit these days, Shalan, the main thing that everyone's looking at is the Ukraine-Russian war. The Ukraine-Russian war, and remember, I used the words Ukraine-Russian war because the G20 delegation this year changed the wording, because last year they called it the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this year the wording has changed slightly to the war in Ukraine. So there's already a slight change in how people are viewing that invasion. How does that affect Sri Lanka? Well, Sri Lanka is similar to Ukraine in some ways, because it's bordering a very powerful neighbor with which it has had a contentious political history and a relationship. So what does the Russian invasion of Ukraine say about sovereignty? What does it say about the global South's understanding of sovereignty? Countries like India, countries like Brazil, members of the global, they're all part of BRICS. Russia is part of BRICS. And we've seen the position that India is in. We see the position that China is in. They know Russia is an ally, but they're also trying, India and the United States are on the path to becoming very close strategic allies. And India's, somewhat implicit, sometimes explicit support for the Russian invasion has put them in a difficult place. But what does that say about sovereignty? It would have been a really good opportunity for our president to talk a little bit about sovereignty. And I think that's something that's important to Sri Lanka as well.
But Kusum, now, all of these points are very pertinent, very relevant, something that Sri Lankans must address. But first and foremost, there needs to be someone making the decisions. There needs to be someone formulating policies. Now, in an ideal democracy, or at least how those who drafted Sri Lanka's constitution wrote it, the cabinet is supposed to discuss and formulate policies. But of course, cabinet can't do it by themselves. There are officials at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other ministries. They all, collectively, headed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, formulate these policies, make the decisions, and then put it through to the cabinet and get it approved. How do you think that process works in Sri Lanka? Who do you think is really making the decisions?
Well, I think, Sharon, that's a big question. I think in the situation we're in, I have to obviously be a little empathetic with the government, right? Any government that would have been in power right now, it is on a back foot. It's on a bad wicket, to use a cricket analogy. It's always reacting to what's happening, okay? Now that is okay. I understand that point of view to a point. But after a while, any economic management team, any foreign policy management team must become proactive, right? We have to understand where we're going. not just, oh, this is what we've agreed with the IMF, so this is what we can do. I think that kind of thinking is good for stability. It's good to get things back in order. But is the country going to grow with that kind of thinking? The Wickremesinghe government, and I almost said the Rajapaksa government, but it's the Wickremesinghe Rajapaksa government, has missed multiple opportunities in this regard. I think it keeps, so even the information regarding the debt restructuring, it wasn't transparent. We're still having debates around the debt restructuring in some instances.
I mean, I think the best example is the fact that initially they said, we will not touch the EPF, the ETF, the people's pension money, we will not touch a single cent.
Yes.
And now they've gone and slashed it by about 40%.
Yeah, I mean, and the point is there's an intellectual debate happening about this, and that's important to have. But that intellectual debate is really about what is the percentage loss to the pensioners, what's the return, etc. But that takes away from the real fact of the matter, that why are we touching the pension funds before the private creditors? I mean, I think it was Mr. Murtaza Jafferji on your television show, I think it was on Face the Nation, where he said, it seems wrong, just when you think about it, it seems wrong that in a crisis situation you're asking one group of people to pick up the tab, but you're allowing other people to make extraordinary profits, and that's what they're going to be making. They're going to be making extraordinary profits. Let's make no qualms about
because
that.
They purchase these bonds at an extremely high premium.
Discounted rates, and the problem is that this sets a precedent, right? Then how do you trust the government? Do you have faith in the government when they've taken such actions that, and they haven't even really bothered to come out and give us the explanation for this. It's in the weeds of this DSA, the debt sustainability analysis. It's in the weeds of what the IMF have asked us. But people have the right to ask, well, as you mentioned at the top of the show, well, where is the belt tightening from the government? I think the president is heading off to Germany the very next day or something, the day after tomorrow possibly. So where is the belt tightening? I mean, are these essential trips? Was the delegation that went to the United Nations General Assembly an essential delegation? What was the cost of it? So I think these are things that the people, naturally when you're struggling, you're going to ask the question. And it doesn't seem like the problem that Charles and I see is that the president nor the government seem to be interested in what the people are asking. You mentioned you having to put a right to information request just to get official policy. So I think that's part of the problem that I mentioned earlier, is that when you don't have people's mandate, you don't feel responsible to the people. So you're not going to really answer questions. You don't think you have to, and he's probably right. He probably doesn't have to.
But for how long? I think that's the more pertinent question.
Whenever he allows the democratic traditions to restart, I think that's the real question.
But Kusum, since you're in the SJB, I think you could speak a little bit on behalf of the party. We're currently facing, as you said before, this power struggle in the Asia-Pacific in the Indian Ocean region, and with the Sea of Sri Lanka, one of our greatest assets, being in peril because of this geopolitical struggle, mainly between India and China, at least the closest parties to this struggle. Now, a few months ago, we had an incident where a Chinese research vessel visited the Hambantota port. India objected to it. We stayed silent, and at the last moment, we almost went and told India, look here, we've already given them permission. There's nothing else that we can do, so please don't make a scene. Following which, now it's repeating itself. Another Chinese research vessel is coming towards the Hambantota port. They are to engage in research activities with NARA, the National Aquatic Resource Agency. India has voiced their strong objection again. What are we doing different this time? Because, I mean, we've played the hedging game for quite some time. Doesn't really seem to be working out. Two questions, actually. What are we doing? What would you do? Or what would the SJB do differently?
Well, for one thing, I think if a member of the SJB were to go to the United Nations General Assembly in New York or wherever and give an interview, I don't think you would start by being critical of for example, President Wickremesinghe was critical of AUKUS, it's the Australian, UK and US. He called it he called it a military alliance. It's technically a security pact, but then he compared that to Quad, and then he asked, what is India doing there? How can they allow AUKUS, to form in the Indian Ocean? Then he, like I mentioned before, he questioned the legitimacy of the Asia-Pacific framework. Having questioned the legitimacy of the Asia-Pacific framework, he goes on to then justify the Asia-Pacific framework. So it was a very confused interview. I would ask anyone to go and just pay attention to it. In terms of any future government, whether it's SJB or any other party that leads a government, when you go to the UN General Assembly, you don't want to, and you have to understand the context of your visit, both your personal context and the global context. Currently, we have a huge problem between a diplomatic rift between Canada and India. We have rising tensions between India and China, tensions between Australia, tensions between the United States and China. In such a situation, and AUKUS only came out about a year and a half ago, so it's a relatively new idea, and he's already criticizing that. And President Wickremesinghe has taken on the BRICS narrative, and I think the BRICS nations have come out, the global south, they've come out and they're trying to be a little bit of a counter to what they call Western hegemony. And I completely understand the President's point of view. We are a member of the global south, we have relationships with India, Russia, etc. But at the same time, you have to understand where you are, and there's a lot of countries, a lot of leaders in the world that can question the current global international order. I'm afraid the President of Sri Lanka is not one of them. You're not supposed to go out there and make those kinds of remarks. Now, the thing about President Wickremesinghe, he is unique in that he's an elder statesman, and his understanding of history is there for everyone to see. It's clear. He knows his history. The problem is that in his interviews, he seems to show a very good knowledge of the history, but doesn't seem to have any understanding of where that history is going to take us in the future. So he's very good at explaining the rifts between in the Indian Ocean and the Asia Pacific, but he wasn't very clear on where it's going to go. So I think Sri Lanka has to understand, any SGB government, for example, would clearly understand where we are. We are in India's sphere of influence. We have a Sea of Sri Lanka. We're in the Indian Ocean. When you are in India's sphere of influence, you have to be cautious, especially if you have a Chinese entity that runs a port city, which is just on the tip of southern India, especially if you have another port that's also owned on the southern coast by China. Then you have to reconsider the things you're going to say, because you're already in a position that you've put yourself in.
You're compromised.
You're already compromised, and people see that, right? No one's blind to what's been happening. And remember, whether you look at Australia, Australia's had a very recent commission to investigate political interference by Chinese officials. Canada's had one too. And I think we'll come to the murder of the Sikh activist in Ottawa at some point as well. And these are, in light of this is all part of the narrative, the global narrative. So Sri Lanka has to be very careful where we tread. So I would advise anyone to go and check out that interview, and if you think the President did a good job representing Sri Lanka's interests, I think we have to reconsider what Sri Lanka's interests are.
But then, Kusum, you were speaking about not being reactive, but being proactive. Wasn't this the President being proactive?
Well, the President himself mentioned something. He said, well, there's a perception that Sri Lanka has special deals with the Chinese. Those are his words, right? So he's brought out this statement. But he didn't give any clarity. He then pivoted to something else. He said, we don't have it. So about your research vessels, he said, no, if anyone can prove that it's a spy vessel or something, you can, we'll take that up. But is that really the answer you have to give? You can say, we are convinced there is no military capability, there is no spying, no intelligence capability. He mentioned, he was very clear that we had a naval research agreement with some Chinese universities and think tanks, etc. So, but build on that. He seems to sort of take a point of view where he's very dismissive of the question itself. And I think the interviewer at some point, had to press him and say, well, isn't it important? The interviewer asked him, what about the Russian invasion of Ukraine? And he said something like, so what about it? And then he said, well, what about the principles of international law? And he said, what were the principles of international law that were broken in Ukraine? And then the interviewer had to sort of take a step back and said, well, what about the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity? And then the President, gave a more full-blooded answer. But it seemed that initially he was trying to bat away the question. So this is the kind of thing, it's a kind of performance that, and President Wickremesinghe, for all my criticism of him, he's a very capable person. He has a good understanding of the world, right? He's been in this business for a very long time. So I have to say that some of those answers were surprising. I thought he would do a better job than he did.
Kusum, one final question. We're in the final few minutes of the show. Sri Lanka is heading into, we're already in crisis. We're heading into more turmoil, especially with the global order also being challenged in certain ways. Do you think that the current foreign policy that this government is trying to put in place at least would serve the best interest of the country moving forward?
I have to say that foreign policy at the moment, I have to be a little empathetic again, because countries around the world, you're seeing their foreign policies all over the place. Okay, it's not just Sri Lanka. The problem that we have is that we can't afford any missteps. A lot of countries are not in our economic situation, right? So the president was, he seemed to want to keep bringing up the Indian Ocean Rim Organization, right, and saying that why did they form AUKUS when we have the IORA? Now, the point of the matter is he's just, in the answer, in the paragraph before, he was talking about just how important the changes in the global geopolitical situation is. In that case, why is he reverting back to IORA, which is, I think it's not a framework that can help in the current situation, in the current context. So in that sense, we have to accept foreign policy is complex, which is all the more reason why you probably shouldn't have your minister's son hanging around or Rohit Abegunwardhan hanging around your delegation. So it's all one, it all falls back to the same thing, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much, Kusum Vijay, foreign policy analyst and also a member of the working committee of the Samagijana Balavege. Thank you very much to all our viewers out there for tuning in. Until we meet again, take care and God bless.